Hello and welcome everyone to today's regulatory hour. My name is Krista Wolf and I am a board member with the FSBPT and I'm coming to you from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. So good afternoon, early afternoon, late morning, depending on where you're coming from. I'm going to introduce our amazing speaker, Dale Atkins, that's going to help to moderate and get us excited about some legislation and relationships with our boards today. As you know, the Federation is really dedicated to providing some educational content on key issues for all of you that impact regulation. We hope that you find these useful. Today, we're going to delve into the important relationship between regulatory boards and the respective legislatures. And we really would like to encourage your active participation, so feel free to ask questions. We would like group discussions if that is at all possible. We thank you for your attendance. And many of you probably already have met Dale, but if you haven't, he is an amazing individual that has dedicated his time and expertise in representing nonprofit organizations that provide essential public protection services like the FSBPT. So we welcome Dale. So we have today's regulatory session, and the next one will be October 15th at 4 o'clock. And it is entitled Final Orders, and it's going to talk about consent and settlement agreements and post-administrative hearings. So without further ado, Dale, thank you so much for your time, and pretty excited to hear more.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Krista. And I can see you and a few others. You can hear me and see the screen. Everybody's good with that? Carry on. Excellent. So I will add my welcome as well. Welcome to the August 2025 Regulatory Hour, where I think we're talking about what I think is to be a pretty important topic, that probably one that maybe regulatory boards and physical therapy boards don't pay enough attention to, perhaps. But I think in the end, we will be looking for guidance from you all. And so, as Krista has suggested, feel free to unmute and speak up or put something in the chats. I will ask you to put a few things in the chats just to get us warmed up and to get you going, make sure you're listening and involved. So I do want us to pay close attention to the slide that you're looking at now and the symbolic issue of the separation perhaps of legislatures and regulatory boards themselves. So when we get to there we go. This is not meant to mean fractured. That was more supposed to be just a separation. And the idea here is that, well, what role can you as a physical therapy board, a division, if you will, of the executive branch of government, at what role can you play vis-a-vis the legislature? And so that's kind of where we're going to meander our way through. Now, to get there, I think that we will probably cover some fundamental basics that you're very familiar with, but we'll re-emphasize those. But if everyone could take a note now, and I believe for your annual meeting, FSBPT's annual meeting coming up, you have legislatures or a legislator that will be there. So feel free now, as you're thinking about this topic, to formulate questions you may want to ask at the annual meeting. You may want to ask them today or both. So feel free to write those down and engage. So as mentioned now symbolically, the difference between boards and legislatures and where do you cross that little river looking thing in the middle, or where do you not cross it? And I think we might actually look at it like this, because you as a board are a creature of the legislative action, the enactment of a statute that created you, that delegated authority with you, and you as a regulatory board are, if you will, beholden to the parameters placed in that legislation. So basic concept, perhaps not discussed enough, but the power balance may be very different, but maybe it shouldn't be like the slide exists right now, and et cetera. So before we get into the content, big shout out, thanks to FSBPT and its board of directors for putting these webinars on. I enjoy doing them, and I think you have lots of other webinars as well. And I hope you, as the regulatory community of physical therapy, enjoy them as well. So thank you for being here. But board of directors, thanks for putting this on. Rich, Jeff, and the staff, many thanks to the staff for operationalizing all of your programs, FSBPT, including this one, the regulatory hour. So big shout out, thanks to Rich and the entire staff of FSBPT. And the biggest thanks goes to each and every one of you as regulators. You play such an important role, whether you're a board member, whether you're a staff administrator, executive director, or assistant attorney general, investigator, inspector, whatever role it is that you play, you're not thanked enough. So I will thank you to begin with today with a big, hearty, and sincere thanks to start with. As mentioned, I'm Dale Atkinson. I am an attorney. I represent a whole bunch of FSBPT-like groups. I've done it my entire career, as Krista mentioned. And so that's the perspective that I bring to the table, and I hope that my remarks are relevant to you and that you find something to to take home out of this, and maybe something to stimulate you to think, and something to stimulate you not only back in your jurisdictions, but come up at your upcoming annual meeting as well to create some discussions, etc. So let's start with just a true false. Use the chat. Make sure you're listening. Make sure you know how to use the chat. My state board, and this is you. Maybe the "my" is not the best word to you, but my state board is allowed to lobby or influence proposed legislation. Just answer that as a true or false. You may have a lot more to say about it. Which, by the way, if you do, unmute and speak up. So we're going to see some truths and some falses, I guess, that arise out of this. And I might ask anyone who answered true to this, what does that really mean to you? And do you take you as a board, and do you take advantage of this
Walt,
authority that you have there? So,
Wal-
so somebody I think needs to mute or
Walter,
speak up.
no,
You get that too. So I generally, when I ask this question of my clients and the member boards that exist, generally the answer is no, that you do not have the authority to do that. But let's get something out front right now, and that is lobbying and influencing is perhaps different than being an information source. Lobbying and influence is different from providing valuable information to the legislatures that provide them with fodder to perhaps make changes where they might be needed. And whether we're talking about process, authority, scope, or anywhere else, again, I think boards can probably play a much more active role than we think, than perhaps that you think. So, excuse me. So I see again some truths and others. So if anybody wants to speak up to this issue, feel free to unmute and do that. But let's go on to the next one. My state board is allowed to propose legislation. And how does that work within your jurisdiction? So again, true or false? And I'll probably try to draw a line. I'm looking at your chats right now as to where this question starts and the last question ended. But can you propose legislation? And you may not be sure. If you don't know, feel free to put "I don't know" up there as well. But that's an important aspect and an important authority for us to think about. And what role does the executive branch, an agency of the executive branch, play related to sponsoring or soliciting? I see Alaska, they're soliciting sponsors for proposed legislation. So we can modify the language, but kind of the big picture concept is what's at stake here as to your role as a regulatory board related to proposed legislation and others. So most of these are probably going to be no's or falses, but there may be some nuances that we can all learn from if you wish to, again, unmute and speak up related to that question itself. True to both for DC. Excellent. So moving on now, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 low, 10 high, is rate your state board's communications with the executive branch of government, with the governor's office, with the appointing authorities and others. Do you communicate? And if so, is it a lot? Which would be a 10. If it's very little or none, it's a 1, and any point in between. And the curiosity here is not only to address the state board, your relationship with the legislature, but it's with the executive branch as well. And the executive branch appoints you generally to your positions as a board member, and related to the operations of the board itself. So I see one number. So I see some low numbers, and probably not surprised. There's a high number from Ohio. So excellent. So learn from each other. And these are the opportunities you have, not only for these regulatory hours, but at all of your webinars and at your upcoming meetings. So for those 10s, talk to the ones and identify, well, How is it that you communicate with the executive branch? Why do you communicate with the executive branch? And what's the intended outcome of that? And I don't consider this to be off topic because communications, outreach, dealing with the legislature is certainly tied to the role of the executive branch within the governmental process, the enactment and ultimate enactment of legislation that certainly affects you all. So I see some low numbers and some high numbers, not too many in the middle. So I'm kind of surmising from this, not surprising by the way to me, is that there may be less communication. So again, if anybody wants to unmute and talk about this topic or this question, feel free to do that. I'm going to carry on, but I don't mean to cut anyone off. So now same issue, scale of 1 to 10, rate your board's communications with the legislative branch of government. 1 low, 10 high. How often do you do it? And again, we're probably going to ask, I'm going to ask if anybody wants to unmute and say, well, how do you do this? How do you communicate with the legislatures? We have some slides coming up that perhaps address the issue, but I would prefer to see or to hear from you all as to some of the discussions that might exist. So Alaska's got an 8 and Arizona is somewhere in the middle there, 4 to 5. And what do these communications consist of? What do you say? Why do you say it? And at what point in time do you do that? So we've got, again, quite a mix of numbers here. Not surprising with as many groups as I represent and have discussions like this about your relationship, your being the state board relationship with the governors, or excuse me, with the legislative branch is what happens? How do you do this? How do you effectuate what might be important issues to assist the legislature in undertaking its responsibilities? So I see in Alaska letters of support, letters of opposition, and testimony at hearings. So really good point right there to bring up is letters of support or opposition. So Alaska, if you want to answer this or anybody else, are you solicited and asked for your letters of support or opposition by the legislature? Let's stick to the legislature and leave trade and academia out for just a second. Does the legislature solicit input from your board in Alaska or others for those that have high numbers? Are you being asked to communicate with the legislature? So and I see a yes to the chapter, so that would be the trade chapter, I'm assuming, of the state chapter of the trade association. So in
Hey,
the
Dale,
end,
this is
yeah, go ahead.
Alaska.
Sure, go
So-
ahead.
Solicited, no. The board has a legislative committee and they monitor all the legislation that's introduced, and they actively look at it and determine whether or not they're in support or in opposition, and then their own bills that are introduced.
Got it. Thank you, Sherry. And if you want to stay unmuted, I'll ask you a follow-up to that is who writes those letters and how are they ultimately approved? So, and to be more specific, does the issue come up at a board meeting, the board discusses it and then directs staff to write a letter through a motion, or how are these decisions made?
The because the session is short, the legislative committee normally writes the letters, and then we use our electronic voting system to do it for the full board to look at them, review them, and approve them, and then send them forth to the legislation.
So now there's use of technology to help streamline a process because timing is important based upon the legislative period of time that they're in service. Thank you, Sherry. And since Sherry spoke up, Rich, she gets dinner for 2 on Bill Hatherall's credit card to her favorite restaurant in the entire world. So make sure Bill knows about that we're giving some things away. Thank you, Sherry. And feel free to unmute and speak again as well. So we're now deciding, and we're trying to wrap our thoughts around, well, gee, how can we communicate? Should we communicate at what point in time? And is it solicited? The dream world and the naive world that I live in from the standpoint of regulatory boards' relationships with the legislature is the legislature asks for your opinion. especially on a matter that is material to the practice, scope, endorsement statutes, examinations, education. We can think of a lot of examples where the legislatures just do not have the expertise necessary. And in fact, quite frankly, and you all know this, you were created and delegated with authority through the enactment of statutes because you are going to bring that expertise to the table. And you're going to promulgate regs that provide meat to the skeletal statutes that should exist. You're going to interpret ambiguous language using the expertise of the board itself. And I realize boards are comprised of both licensees and public members, which bring very important perspectives to the table. But these are all important aspects. So the dream world that I live in, and I am advising my clients to enact in their practice acts, is to consider puts in their model practice acts, is to consider putting something in the model practice act that says all material issues, all material amendments to the practice act shall be brought to the board for comment prior to enactment. And something along those lines. So we do encourage this solicitation rather than the board determining to just, this is an important issue, let's write a letter of opposition or a letter of support and sending it in. I think the give and take, the back and forth, the elimination of that river on that first slide that looked like it was separating the two, that is diminished or eliminated to the extent possible. And again, I don't want to sound too naive, but I think there's room for this, and there should be a recognition of the expertise of the boards themselves. So again, Sherry, thanks for speaking up. And let me continue to advance. Here we go. So I've already touched upon this a little bit, but the quick refresher, and I think it's important to step back and look at some of these basic issues as we determine, well, how should regulatory boards communicate with the legislature, and to recognize the deference that's necessary. And that is, at least starting on this particular slide, is that you, as I've mentioned earlier, you are creatures of statute. You exist because the legislature determined to pass a law to create and delegate authority to you to regulate the profession, and let's call it in the interest of public protection, consistent with the language of the statute itself. So physical therapy boards have to be deferential to the legislature. But again, this does not mean that you need to sit back and ignore and allow trade and other special interest groups to dictate and influence the process, or the content, I should say, of the legislation that exists there. So you are technically part of the executive branch of government. Most all of you are probably appointed by the governor's office or by the governor, him or herself, and you are populated through that process, and the composition of that board can be very important. We've already talked about created and delegated with authority, and in the end, the big picture issue is you can only do what the law recognizes you to do. So the language of the statute itself. And so regulations cannot be promulgated that extend beyond the scope of the authority of the board. That is done through legislation, not through the promulgation of regulations. And so very quick refresher still, statutes enacted by the legislature, regulations promulgated by the board. Regulations are generally to add specificity to the generalities of a statute. So we're all on the same page from some of the terminology that we do use. So it's really important now to say, well, with that in mind, with deferential, recognition of the legislature itself, well, how do we now interact with that entity that did create us and authorized us? A big portion of a practice act is the composition of the board itself. It's going to be set in statute. Board shall consist of 7 individuals, 5 of whom shall be licensed, 2 of whom shall be public, something along those lines. Perhaps there are others in there, academics, perhaps there's geographic distribution of the appointment process, whatever it turns out to be in your jurisdiction. Well, you, by virtue of being on this call, you, by virtue of being appointed, you, by virtue of being a part of the FSBPT, are now, within this regulatory community. Generally, licensees appointed to boards are there for their subject matter expertise. And to reiterate, that's where you use the knowledge, skills, and abilities you have to then enforce the Practice Act, promulgate regs, etc. So that subject matter expertise can be important. And you can see where we're going with this. We're setting up the point of, well, who should be consulted when legislation is undertaken and potential changes are made to something very specific to the practice, like the scope. How is that going to be defined? So there should be a communications and a solicitation from the legislatures. It may not happen. I get it. It probably doesn't happen in most of your jurisdictions, but these are best practices I think we can strive for. So public members on there serve a very important role. I do not mean to eliminate them from the discussions, and mention perhaps others are on there as well, dictated by what the statute says, academics or other professions that are represented within the physical therapy boards, makeup, etc. So we need this foundational knowledge in order to I think form the basis for convincing, if you will, legislatures that the communications back and forth between the legislature and the boards is critical. And I believe that, and it just doesn't happen as much as it probably should. So we've talked enough about perspectives, the expertise, your authority to promulgate the rules and regs, to interpret ambiguous language and others. It is so important for the legislature to have that understanding. And I do a ton of board member training for my clients, and occasionally I've been asked to and provided, if you will, training to the legislatures. And I think we would all be surprised as to I don't know if lack of knowledge is the right way to put it, but the legislature's view of what regulatory boards do, what you do as regulators, what you do as an agency or a department and or board created to fulfill the intent of the legislation. So these communications can only help. They can only help so that where we land, you, the regulatory community, where you land is consistent with the public protection mandates using the expertise of the boards themselves. So look at the subjectivity driven issues that do surface. And does the legislature have a handle on what important decisions you might make? And good moral character, personal history, criminal background checks, pursuits of complaints, declaratory positions or statements, whatever you think about, and try to articulate the authority that you have. I might suggest the legislatures don't know what it is that you do as a regulatory board. So how are we going to solve that? We'll get to that in a few slides, but get more people to participate in or attend the regulatory process and to watch regulatory boards in action, physical therapy or otherwise, by the way. We've talked about ambiguous language and scope, at least enough to set the stage for this, but there's the potential for much subjectivity in decision making that has to be had. And with that subjectivity comes decisions where some will be recognized and some may not. Well, the legislation has to provide you with not only the authority, but some parameters around how that decision will be made. Dale, you get a license, or let me use Krista, you get a license because you meet the requirements. Dale, you don't get a license. You don't meet the requirements. And without this foundational knowledge, I think it's very difficult to create an argument that the legislature should and must communicate with the boards themselves. That's why I'm taking this step back, and we're navigating our way and meandering toward the purpose and the scope of today's session, and that is that relationship between the two. So learn to articulate this. I think we're going to be much better off at convincing the legislature how it might continue to allow and participate with the boards themselves that you've created. So you can read your Model Practice Act, the FSBPT Model Practice Act itself, and it's a tool to be used for public protection. It's a tool and a resource to be used to help legislatures perhaps, one, address important issues, two, it promotes uniformity, and others. And you can see just from the language here is that you're a resource to the jurisdictions. So most all of my clients have model practice acts, and I enjoy helping them be written and others. And then once they're completed, what happens to them? Does your board have an opportunity to discuss the Model Practice Act back in your jurisdiction? Does your board then ultimately have an opportunity to say to the legislature, hey, when we're dealing with an issue, administrative authority over unlicensed practice, well, here is our model language in the act, our Model Practice Act. It represents the collective wisdom of regulators across the nation. And here is something for you, legislature, to consider enacting. How often does that happen? Probably very rarely. And so you, FSBPT, go through the process of making a model act. Can we take that next step with the model act? Can it be promoted and used by member boards, you all back in your jurisdictions, to then promote not only the uniformity, but the important public protection aspects of regulating of physical therapy and physical therapy assistance? So anybody want to chime in, unmute, or put something in the chat? Do you talk about the Model Act in your state board meeting? One, do you promote the Model Act, if you will, to the legislatures in any way, shape, or form? For those of you who are tens or high numbers on your communications with the legislature, does the Model Act help form a basis for opening the doors to communications? Does the Model Act then provide the legislature with that collective wisdom we've already talked about? And how is it used? So feel free to unmute if somebody wants to say something or type something in the chat. I think this is very helpful, not only to today's discussion, but it's as helpful to FSBPT as an organization of whom you are the members to decide, well, how can we best promote, if you will, this uniformity and this language that has been vetted through the development process of the Model Act. So again, these resources that are available to you, I believe, can help open the door to this question of relationship and communications with the legislature, even if it's not enacted or used or verbatim or others. NABP, which is the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy, it's the equivalent of FSBPT in the world of pharmacy. Their Model Act has received a lot of traction legislatively from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and it is helping promote that kind of uniformity. So I do see Arizona a long history of using the Model Act to incorporate into your statute. So Arizona, anything you've got to say, feel free to say it, bring it up at the annual meeting, whatever it takes to say, here's how we, Arizona, have benefited from it. You other jurisdictions, you might consider this. We might give you some ideas or some best practices to put that forth. So thank you for chiming in on that, Mindy, as well. Now here's your scope of practice. This is only here. This is way too many words on a slide. This is only here to say, look at the expertise it takes to draft this, right? Okay. And who wrote this? Model Act. Now, in the Model Act, you all can say we have committees and, you went through the whole process to narrow it down and used a lot of expertise across the nation to ultimately land here and define physical therapy. Since I'm in Utah, I picked out Utah statute. So, well, who wrote this? Right? Legislature, probably, right? Maybe there's a pretty heavy trade influence and others. Great, no problem. That's not a bad thing. But when you realize this and say you as a regulator and as a regulatory board are being asked to interpret and enforce this Practice Act, how could a legislature not ask for your opinion? How could a legislature say we don't need the opinion of the board in either drafting or amending what you're reading right now? No matter what the words say up here, it takes expertise. It takes knowledge about the practice itself. And suffice it to say, most regulators, most elected officials, excuse me, not regulators, most elected officials, most politicians, if I can use that word, are not physical therapists. And they may not have that kind of expertise. So how do we get those doors open? How do we get the legislature to say, hey, we're amending a practice act. Maybe we better hear from the board. Is this a good idea, bad idea? Are we ambivalent about it, or what have you?
Dale,
So-
Mindy from Arizona. I would just
Yeah.
say that our professional association has been just fabulous in terms of connecting with our legislators on an ongoing basis and just keeping it front and center when needed changes are made. They've been very active over many years to try and align the Model Practice Act, get it in front of the legislators. They use that as a tool to then craft the legislation that then we have to interpret. So it actually makes it our job a little bit easier as regulators, because we have a foundational document that's out there, that we can reference. So it's been very helpful having the association be involved in the legislative process at the state level.
Excellent. And Rich, Mindy gets dinner for two as well at her favorite restaurant. So just send that on as well. So people that you're catching on here when you speak up, there might be a prize that you get to win fictitiously, of course. But well, thank you for that. So and the follow up to Mindy, and you don't have to answer this, but what if the state chapter, the trade association is taking a position that may not be in the minds of the board in the best interest of consumer and public protection? And now you've got, an issue here. And so I fully support trade associations. They're there to influence and lobby, and they're there to promote the profession. All that is great. And then there's also the potential to have disagreement between what is best for public protection. And that message may not be carried by trade all the time. So I'm not dissing the trade associations, but Mindy brings up a great point. Your relationship with the trade association is probably as important as your relationship with the executive branch and perhaps the legislature as well. But
and it hasn't been for us not having, opinions about stuff that the association brings forward that we don't necessarily will find easy to administer,
Yeah.
The latest being the legislation around imaging and lab results, and that, how do we legislate that?
Got it.
Interpret that.
And I'll give a quick story. And now there's some, it's a fine line to walk, and you have to work together. Granted, on all that, I do agree. And to me, communications in all directions is absolutely critical, whether we're talking executive branch, legislature, trade, academics, FSBPT, of course, whatever. I'll give you just a little story of one of my clients who ASWB, it's the social work group. They released a study of exam results based on demographics that were voluntarily disclosed, and it has led to a added scrutiny to the examination itself. And is the exam with disparate outcomes? Is it an unlawful exam versus is it an indication of systemic issues of society, or whatever the issues might be? But what has happened now is multiple boards that belong to ASWB are promoting eliminating the exam from licensure requirements. Okay, fair enough. I mean, if we can have an intellectual discussion about it, I'm happy to do that. But the point being is that the trade is also jumping in saying, get rid of that exam. So, there may be times when trade's views might not align with the boards, but again, I don't say this to not communicate. I say this it's better to know what everybody's talking about and find some common ground and carry on. But these are all really great points that are being made, and that should be taken into consideration by the boards themselves. Remember, when you sit and serve on your state board, you're a regulator, not a practitioner. But when you take your practitioner licensee hat off and put your regular hat on, the knowledge doesn't go away. So it's all about perspective. Keep all that in mind. And this is discussed quite a bit in your board trainings that you have and others. So fine lines, important relationships, keep the communications going. I am not suggesting anything be abandoned related to that. So again, thank you, Mindy, and thanks for the chats so far that have been coming in. I find some statutes interesting, and Utah, since I was reading it, this is what physical therapy means or physiotherapy means. And then the legislation go on and say, this is what it doesn't mean. And so sometimes that's important. And I think writing a legislation with a scope of practice can be a little bit difficult. The rest of the legislation is much easier, but what kind of communications is and should be had related to issues like this. So So who wrote this definition saying Utah? The legislature, sure. Assistance with the trade, probably influence from that. And at what point were you consulted, Utah? If you're on the phone today or if you're on the line today, were you consulted? Should you have been? How do we open up those doors? So again, the idea behind today's session is to brainstorm as best we can how to get those doors open, and in a constructive, positive way. This is not a no, you can't do this or what have you. This is more of a let's continue to communicate so that in the end the best product comes out of this. And I realize that sounds naive, and it is to some degree. But I think if we don't push toward this, we're never going to get closer. And across all the professions that I work with, we all need to improve. We, the regulatory community, needs to improve on this door opening with the legislature as best we possibly can. So ideas welcome. Take those to your annual meeting as well next month, or in October when it is. So so now with some of this foundation, does anyone want to unmute and say, tell me about your board? If I'm the legislature and I came to you, and I'm a subcommittee of the legislature dealing with the regulation of the professions, unmute and you tell me, or tell the rest of your colleagues or peers on the line today, well, tell me about the relationship between the board and the legislature. Tell me what it is and what you think it should be. Anybody want to take a crack at that? Maybe you get round trip airfare wherever you want to fly or something like that would entice you. But how would you convince us? And do you engage in these exercises at your board meetings or others? And can you and should you do that? And so I'll go on to the next slide, but if anybody wants to at any point unmute and talk about this. But yeah, go ahead.
This is Sonora. As you know, this is years and years for me, for the rest of the people online. One of the things is that we have to be more involved in other things than the board. And so that way you're known in the community, so that you want to be able to establish a close relationship with the legislature and make sure that they know you for something else other than sitting on the board. You have more of an identity than just being a PT. It is that you are serving the community. And after all, that's what politicians swear to God they're doing. That's another webinar, but that's how you have to get to them as a person, where they know that, and they also know that you won't lie or that you will help them in some way. So it's really this whole business of developing a relationship. That's probably why you were appointed to the board in the first place. And that working with the chapter is real important, because what you are hoping is that from that chapter, you will be able to get some people to serve on the board. People are not volunteering now their time. And so we have to develop close relationships in the community that we serve. But don't forget the contiguous states too. So in DC, remember, we have to worry about Maryland and Virginia, and that we have a relationship with those groups too, because quite often therapists are traveling back and forth, and especially with the combined boards.
Excellent. Thank you, Sonora. I mean, listen to all those ideas now to develop, strengthen, and evolve these relationships, not only with the legislature, but trade, academics, or whomever, to get that word out. And I think what Sonora said too, if I tried to summarize it all, then it turns into influence. And influence then can help dictate, if you will, hopefully, wise legislative decisions that might surface out of that. And all of this is done. Sonora's everything she just said is done, making sure we understand which hat we're wearing and when, and how those hats may need to be removed or recognized or taken off. So, excuse me. Excellent, Sonora. Thank you. So you get tickets to a show in Las Vegas next time you're out there. So, thank you for that. Others who want to talk about developing, strengthening, evolving your relationship with the legislature and ideas. The next couple slides are some of the ideas. And by the way, these slides are belong to FSBPT as far as I'm concerned. So Rich and Jeff can share them if you would like, but any other ideas that exist that might help strengthen those. And again, feel free to just unmute and go ahead and start talking. I don't mind if you interrupt me, but here's some of my ideas. One is robust board meeting minutes. We've had a webinar on this several months ago, and I've talked about this topic a lot with my clients and their member boards themselves. And I can't tell you how many minutes that I read when I'm looking for something or I'm just preparing for a presentation, and the minutes are really not very indicative of all the important work the board does. So robust minutes, and that's a topic for another day. It's a topic we've already had, and I think you can go back and watch it if you'd like. But robust minutes that identify the mission, vision, the values of the board, and then all the data that's necessary. So when someone outside of the regulatory community, like an elected official, reads them, they know you know what you're doing. And by the way, every time I read minutes, then it helps educate the reader as well. So these robust meeting minutes are just critical, and a template for minutes is maybe a good idea for for FSBPT and the regulatory boards themselves if you don't already have one. But submitting of annual reports. So if I'm running your board, I am going to submit a report to the legislature at the end of every year. I'm going to include, by the way, those robust minutes, which are well written, hopefully, and I'm going to include the accomplishments and others, and in some of the pitfalls that exist out there. The regulatory board does not have authority over unlicensed practice. The legislature, we'd ask you to address this issue. Something that gets this kind of communications questions going. So even if you don't have to file an annual report, do it anyway with the legislature or select committees of the legislature and the executive branch. And in a sense, you're saying, we know what we're doing. Here's what we've done for the last year, and we look forward to continuing to serve the community or the public protection. Invite legislators to board meetings. There's nothing I'd like better if I were running one of your boards to have a room full of people. And it's not just respondents and their lawyers that are nervous because there's an adverse action coming down the pike. It's more of a legislators are there, the media is there, the academics are there, the trades there, licensees are there. I would give free CE for attending board meetings, by the way, if I could do that all by myself and get people to come to these meetings. The better, the more attention your board gets. And by the way, then you have to have well-run meetings and, as I mentioned, well-written minutes. But it brings attention to the board in a positive light. Look at this volunteerism that we're surrounded with. And look at the important role that this board plays, and look at how they understand it, and look at how they need a little help because the legislation is lacking in a certain way, or there's not enough funding, or whatever the issues that surface. So invite legislators to the board meetings. If they don't show up, I'd send them a letter afterwards and say, we missed you. Here's a copy of our minutes after they've been approved, by the way. And two is if they're well written. And we look forward to seeing you at a future meeting. You can get this relationship. We can open these doors by perhaps some of these ideas. Maybe we can call them best practices, whatever you want to call them. Reach out with board FSBPT programs, services, and products that talk about effectiveness and efficiencies. We have a uniform licensure exam program that we're using. We have access to the data banks and the ELDD. Is it ELDD? If I got that wrong, Rich will correct me. But we have access to programs and services through our organization, FSBPT, that make us more effective and efficient. And included within that, by the way, is a model act. So therefore, it's a template for legislative activity, et cetera. Testifying and others. I think some of you put that in your comments earlier today that you may provide testimony. Let's hope that you do. Let's hope that you're asked to provide that kind of testimony. Invite others to the board meetings themselves. And by the way, invite other boards to meet in conjunction with your board. I've talked about this issue quite a bit over the last several years, and have boards that have overlapping scopes and like interests, of course, public protection, meet together to talk about, well, can a physical therapist work on an animal? And the vet board sitting in there, you identify your commonalities and your differences, and this can then lead to clarifying amendments to the legislation that exists. Well, we better clarify this. Well, who can work on animals, or perhaps who cannot work on animals, and let's figure that out. So the collective wisdom of multiple boards intrastate can be important, just like FSBPT provides the interstate communications between physical therapy boards themselves. Executive directors can communicate with each other. This is done it's pretty common, but if it's not being done a lot in your jurisdictions, maybe you as an exec can stimulate these kinds of meetings you have, and you talk about, again, where things are working and not working. Board meetings agendas to entice change. Talk about the legislation. Talk about where it may be lacking or where it's good. Talk about what other professions may be experiencing through their legislation that provides positive outcomes that you may need over here on the physical therapy side. There are so many opportunities to create this kind of momentum that I think might help open the doors to the legislature. Be an information source to the legislature. It's on there, data. Put that in your minutes. And for some of you that go through sunset, you're already doing a lot of this. You have these reports, will make them be known. And again, tout the effectiveness and the efficiencies of the board itself to the best you can. And we've already mentioned this many times: trade association relationship, academic, employers. You could probably think many more than I'm going to think of right now, but to establish these relationships. All of this, to Sonora's point, is enhanced communication, one, enhanced relationships, two, and eventually influence on legislative action. And it may not come from your board, it may come from trade, it may come from the academics, it may come from the employers. So how do we get this out there? And the bottom line on this slide here is I understand the politics of these issues. I understand that it's not as simple as it may sound when we just talk about it, but we need to start somewhere. We need to start and evolve these kinds of relationships to the best we can. So this is my blank slide, because sometimes my mind goes blank and I think I accidentally left this in there, but let's leave the slide up here. Anybody have anything to say about what's been said today, ideas, or what you're doing to help your fellow regulators who are on the line today? Feel free to unmute or what have you. So I see a parliamentarian, National Association of Parliamentarians, to give lectures on minutes. There you go, for have effective board meetings. Everybody will be into Robert's rules. I mean, it's the most exciting topic ever. So, but it is important, I think, to talk about process so the attendees know. And when I'm asked to critique a board meeting, a state board meeting like yours, sometimes I think there's a lack of talk to the audience. Let's hope you have attendees there who are not the regulars, and just quickly summarize. Here's what the board does. Here's how today's meetings will be run. Here's how your voice can be heard, or what have you. So I think there's benefit to these kinds of disclosures. And Robert's Rules for Dummies. Excellent. I will end my remarks, but if anybody's anything to say, feel free to do that. But I will take the time now, since I'm on this slide, to again say a big shout out, thanks to your board of directors, thanks to the staff, Rich and everyone, and a big thanks to each and every one of you for not only being on the line today, but for everything that you do for regulation and for public protection. And I'm hoping that today's session can stimulate some ideas that we're not thinking of right now, but they might surface. So everybody write down a question or two, take it to your annual meeting, and ask your legislature something. What do we need to know? How do we communicate with you? Can you communicate with us? How do we get involved in this process to ensure public protection is maintained and it's consistent with what the intent of the legislature is? So everybody write a question down and take it with you to your annual meeting. But if it's quiet right now, Krista, I will turn it back to you for any kind of wrap-ups. But again, a big shout out. Thanks for having me involved in your webinars.
Dale, thank you so much. I think some great conversation was had this afternoon. I think we can all agree there's some key takeaways from this, that Consistent, transparent communication is key between our organizations, amongst different groups. We talked about building relationships and making connections. Sonora, you had a great ideas about that, and engaging and collaborating, writing thank yous, follow up after meetings. Most importantly, that you hear from us a lot is that we want to demonstrate value and impact. And how do we do that best? Support it with data, right? As Dale said, data, data, data. So that's fantastic. And just being reliable and building those relationships just with small gestures. So I enjoyed the conversation today. This was great. I'm going to put in the chat, I accidentally hit send a little early. I didn't understand that when I hit enter, it actually sent. But we do have some more webinars, so I'm putting it in here. So Dale will be back in October, but we do have some coming in September as well. So I just put those in the chat for you. You can also go to the FSBPT website and go after you log in, go under events, and it will list all of that for you. But if anyone has any questions, we still have a few minutes left. We'd be happy to take them. And don't forget, the annual meeting is in October, the 24th and 25th. If you can't make it in person, you can always attend virtually. We appreciate everyone's input and suggestions. So if anyone has anything they'd like to ask or say, you have the floor.
Krista, this is Michelle. Dale and Krista, thank you for a really wise and helpful webinar here today. I'd just like to put in a selfish plug on behalf of the board of directors to urge you to engage your board liaison to also support you at a jurisdictional level, whether attending the meetings virtually or on person. We love doing it. We learn a lot, and we might have a few resources to be able to share with you too. Thank you.
Excellent point, Michelle. Okay. Well, if there's no other questions or comments, again, thank you all for attending. And I hope everybody has a lovely afternoon. And you guys know how to reach out. And we will see you next time, possibly September 24th. Thanks again, Dale.